Marcus Johnson sat in his expensive office on the 35th floor of Thompson and Associates law firm, staring at his phone in disbelief. The call he had just received made his blood boil. His 16-year-old cousin, Andrew, had been arrested for allegedly stealing from a convenience store, something Marcus knew his cousin would never do. The young attorney's fingers moved quickly across his keyboard as he pulled up Andrew's case file. At just 28 years old, Marcus was already making waves in the legal community. He had graduated top of his class from Harvard Law School and passed the bar exam with one of the highest scores in the state's history. But right now, none of those achievements could calm the anger rising in his chest. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, his dark eyes scanning the police report. The evidence was flimsy at best. The store's security camera had been broken that day, and the only witness was the store owner who admitted he had caught a glimpse of the thief running away. Yet somehow, Andrew was facing up to 2 years in juvenile detention. Marcus loosened his silk tie and began digging deeper. As he reviewed similar cases from the past 6 months, a disturbing pattern emerged. Judge Catherine Reynolds, who was assigned to Andrew's case, had an unusually high conviction rate for minority youth. The sentences she handed out were also consistently harsher compared to those given to white teenagers charged with similar crimes. "Hey, Marcus, you okay?" Sarah Chen, his colleague, knocked on his office door. "It's past 9 p.m. Marcus looked up, suddenly realizing his office was the only one still lit on the entire floor. "Sarah, come look at this," he waved her over. For the next 20 minutes, he showed her the troubling statistics he had uncovered about Judge Reynolds. "This is serious," Sarah agreed, her forehead creasing with concern. "But what can we do? She's been on the bench for 15 years. Nobody's ever successfully challenged her decisions." Marcus stood up and walked to his office window, looking out at the city lights below. The view usually calmed him, but tonight it only reminded him of how many young lives might have been ruined by Judge Reynolds' prejudiced rulings. As he stood there, an idea began forming in his mind. A risky, crazy idea that could either end his career or expose years of judicial misconduct. What if, he turned to Sarah slowly, we could prove her bias beyond any doubt? What if we could show everyone exactly how she treats young minorities in her courtroom? Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly would we do that?" Marcus walked back to his desk and picked up a photo from his last family barbecue. In it, he was wearing casual clothes, jeans and a t-shirt instead of his usual designer suits. Several people had commented that he looked like a teenager in the picture. "I could pass for a high school student," he said thoughtfully, "especially if I dressed the part." Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. "Marcus, no, that's insane. You could get disbarred." "Not if we do it right," Marcus replied, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We need to document everything. Get the right people involved. Make sure every single interaction is recorded legally." He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a news article about Judge Reynolds' latest controversial ruling: a 3-year sentence for a black teenager accused of stealing a bicycle, while a white teenager in a similar case the same week got only community service. "Someone needs to stop this," Marcus said firmly. "These are kids' lives we're talking about. My cousin Andrew could be next." Sarah sat down heavily in one of the office chairs. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Marcus nodded, his determination growing stronger by the minute. "I'll need help, though. Inside the courthouse, someone to manage the paperwork, coordinate with witnesses." "You're crazy." Sarah shook her head, but a small smile was forming on her face. "But if you're really doing this, I'm in." For the next few hours, Marcus and Sarah worked on their plan. They would need to create a foolproof alternate identity, coordinate with trusted court officials, and most importantly, find a way to document every interaction with Judge Reynolds without breaking any laws. As the first light of dawn began to creep into his office, Marcus finally sat back in his chair, exhausted but satisfied. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of transforming himself from Marcus Johnson, Harvard-educated attorney, into Deandra Williams, a teenager from the wrong side of the tracks. And Judge Catherine Reynolds wouldn't know what hit her until it was too late. The next morning, Marcus stood in front of his full-length mirror, hardly recognizing himself. Gone was the confident attorney in expensive suits. Instead, he saw a teenager wearing baggy jeans, an oversized hoodie, and worn-out sneakers. He had spent the past week carefully planning this transformation. "Man, this is weird," he muttered, adjusting the fake silver chain around his neck. His usually neat haircut had grown out, and he'd gotten rid of his designer glasses in favor of contact lenses. The transformation wasn't just about looks. He had spent hours practicing a different way of talking and walking. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Everything's ready at the courthouse," she texted. "Judge Reynolds has court duty today. Are you sure about this?" Marcus took a deep breath and texted back, "No turning back now." He grabbed his backpack, not the leather briefcase he usually carried, and headed out. Instead of taking his Mercedes, he caught the public bus to a neighborhood on the other side of town. Every detail had to be perfect for their plan to work. The plan was simple but risky. Marcus would get himself arrested for a minor offense, just enough to land in Judge Reynolds' courtroom. Sarah had already arranged for specific court officers to be on duty, ones they trusted who would play along without revealing his true identity. As Marcus walked through the rundown neighborhood, he felt strange. This was where he grew up, but it felt different now. He passed the corner store where he used to buy candy as a kid. Old Mr. Wilson was still there, sweeping the sidewalk. "Showtime," Marcus whispered to himself. He had chosen this store carefully. Mr. Wilson had recently installed new security cameras, which would be crucial for their plan. Walking into the store, Marcus pulled his hoodie lower over his face. He grabbed a few snacks and purposely let a candy bar slip into his pocket where the cameras could clearly see it. Then he paid for the other items and started to leave. "Hey, young man," Mr. Wilson called out, right on cue. They had arranged this whole scene the day before. "Empty your pockets." Marcus played his part perfectly, acting nervous and defensive. "I didn't do nothing," he protested, using the street slang he practiced. Within minutes, a police car arrived. Officer Rodriguez, who was also in on the plan, handled the arrest. They had to make everything look real while ensuring Marcus's rights weren't actually violated. The officer read him his rights and put him in handcuffs, though not too tightly. At the police station, Marcus continued his act. He gave his fake name, Deandra Williams, and a made-up address. The booking officer, Detective Martinez, was one of the few people who knew Marcus's true identity. She processed him quickly, making sure he would appear before Judge Reynolds that afternoon. Sarah met him briefly in a private room at the courthouse, disguised as a public defender. "Judge Reynolds is in a particularly bad mood today," she whispered. "She just gave a black teenager 6 months for spraying graffiti." Marcus nodded. "Perfect. That works in our favor. Your case is in 30 minutes, Sarah continued, checking her watch. "Remember, we have hidden cameras in the courtroom, all legal and approved by the Judicial Review Board. Every word will be recorded." Marcus sat in the holding cell, his heart pounding. This wasn't his first time in a courtroom, but it was his first time sitting on the defendant's side. Around him, other teenagers waited nervously for their hearings. He listened to their stories, feeling even more certain that what he was doing was right. Finally, a court officer called out, "Deandra Williams." Marcus stood up, keeping his head down. As he shuffled into the courtroom, he could feel Judge Reynolds' eyes on him. She sat high on her bench, her gray hair pulled back severely, her face already showing disapproval. "Another one," she muttered, loud enough for the first row to hear. She picked up his file, her lips curling in disgust. "Let's see what we have here." Marcus kept his eyes down, but his mind was sharp. Every word, every expression, every biased comment would be caught on camera. The trap was set. Judge Reynolds adjusted her glasses and looked down at him with the same contempt she had shown countless other young black defendants. "Well, Mr. Williams, let's see if we can't teach you a lesson about respect for the law." Little did she know, she was the one about to learn a lesson, one that would end her career. The courtroom was silent except for the steady hum of the air conditioning. Marcus, now fully in character as Deandra Williams, stood before Judge Reynolds with his shoulders slightly hunched. He wore the perfect expression of nervous defiance that he had practiced for hours in front of his mirror. "So, Mr. Williams," Judge Reynolds began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I see you thought it would be fun to steal from a hard-working business owner." She peered down at him over her reading glasses. "I ain't steal nothing," Marcus mumbled, using the poor grammar deliberately. He could see Sarah, disguised as his public defender, tensing beside him. They had practiced this exchange countless times. Judge Reynolds' nostrils flared. "Excuse me? In my courtroom, we speak proper English. I didn't steal anything. But I suppose proper grammar isn't a priority in your environment." The hidden cameras were catching everything: her tone, her expression, her assumptions. Marcus noticed several people in the gallery shifting uncomfortably at her obvious prejudice. "Sorry, Your Honor," Marcus said, making his voice crack slightly. I didn't steal anything." Judge Reynolds picked up his fake file, making a show of reading through it. "Let's see. No father in the home, mother working 2 jobs, failing grades." She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. A familiar story. Sarah stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client has no prior record. The security footage only shows the candy bar falling into his pocket accidentally. Mr. Wilson, the store owner, is willing to drop the charges." "Ms. Chen," Judge Reynolds cut her off sharply. "I'm sure you're new to this, but these individuals need to learn that actions have consequences. A light sentence now might save him from worse crimes later." Marcus watched the court reporter's fingers flying across the keyboard, recording every biased word. He also noticed a man in the back of the courtroom writing in a small notebook, one of the Judicial Review Board members they had quietly invited to observe. "But Your Honor," Marcus spoke up, purposely sounding scared but determined. "In Thompson versus State of Georgia, didn't the court rule that circumstantial evidence alone—" "Oh," Judge Reynolds laughed, and several court officers joined in nervously. "Someone's been watching too much TV. Law and order doesn't make you a lawyer, young man." Marcus ducked his head, but inside he was smiling. She had taken the bait perfectly, dismissing his legal knowledge simply because of how he looked. "Your Honor," Sarah tried again, "my client raises a valid legal point." "Miss Chen, control your client," Judge Reynolds snapped. "This kind of disrespect for the court will not help his case." She shuffled some papers on her desk, then leaned forward with what she probably thought was a motherly expression. "Mr. Williams, I'm going to do you a favor. Instead of sending you to juvenile detention immediately, I'm going to schedule another hearing for next week. I will give you time to think about your choices." Marcus looked up, allowing a flash of real legal understanding to show in his eyes. "But Your Honor, doesn't the statute require—" "Enough." Judge Reynolds banged her gavel. "One more word of your street corner law, and I'll hold you in contempt. Next Thursday, 9 a.m. And Mr. Williams," she gave him a cold smile, "wear something more appropriate. This isn't a rap video." As the bailiff led Marcus away, he caught sight of Sarah quickly hiding a small smile. Phase 1 had gone perfectly. Judge Reynolds had shown her prejudices clearly, dismissing valid legal arguments because they came from someone she saw as just another black teenager from the streets. Back in the holding area, Marcus waited until he was alone before letting out a quiet breath of relief. Through the walls, he could hear Judge Reynolds starting another case, her voice carrying the same tone of superiority and prejudice. His phone, hidden in a secret pocket, vibrated once. A text from Sarah. "Got everything. Video, audio, transcript. She couldn't have been more obvious if we'd asked her to be." Marcus smiled. One hearing down, several more to go. Each interaction would build their case stronger, documenting Judge Reynolds' pattern of discrimination. She thought she was teaching a lesson to a troubled teen, but she was really digging her own professional grave. As Marcus was led out of the courthouse, he heard Judge Reynolds' voice booming from her courtroom. "Another one. How many of these delinquents am I seeing today?" "More than you expect, Judge," Marcus whispered to himself. "And one of them is about to end your career." The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the unusually knowledgeable street kid who kept challenging Judge Reynolds, and today's hearing had drawn a large crowd. Marcus noticed at least 5 members of the Judicial Review Board scattered throughout the gallery, their notebooks ready. Sarah had outdone herself with the preparations. Hidden cameras were in place, and 3 court reporters were present instead of the usual one. She had also made sure his cousin Andrew was sitting in the front row, along with several other teenagers who had received unfair sentences from Judge Reynolds. "Danger Williams," the bailiff called out. Marcus walked to the center of the courtroom, still wearing his baggy clothes and red hoodie. Judge Reynolds looked down at him with her usual contempt, but today he noticed something else in her expression, curiosity mixed with suspicion. Mr. Williams, she began, shuffling through his papers, my clerk has been unable to verify some of your background information. Would you care to explain? This was the moment they had been waiting for. Marcus straightened up slowly, his entire demeanor changing. When he spoke, gone was the street accent he'd been using for weeks. Instead, his voice carried the polished tones of a Harvard-educated attorney. Actually, Your Honor, I would be happy to explain everything. Judge Reynolds blinked, startled by the transformation. The courtroom fell silent. My name is not Dandra Williams, Marcus continued, reaching into his hoodie pocket. He pulled out his State Bar Association card and his law firm ID. I am Marcus Johnson, Senior Associate at Thompson & Associates Law Firm, Harvard Law School Class of 2019, and member of the State Bar. The judge's face went pale, her hands gripped the edge of her bench. What is the meaning of this? The meaning, Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice clear and strong, is that for the past 3 weeks, I have been documenting your systematic discrimination against young minority defendants in your courtroom. Gasps filled the room. Judge Reynolds tried to bang her gavel, but Marcus continued speaking. I have appeared before you 4 times, presenting valid legal arguments that you dismissed solely because you believed they came from an uneducated black teenager. Each time, you showed clear bias in your reactions and rulings. This is outrageous, Judge Reynolds sputtered. I'll have you disbarred for this deception. Actually, Your Honor. Sarah stood up, removing her fake glasses. Everything we've done is perfectly legal. I'm Sarah Chen, also from Thompson & Associates, and we have written approval from the State Judicial Review Board for this investigation. On cue, 5 people stood up in the gallery, showing their Judicial Review Board badges. Judge Reynolds' face went from pale to ashen. Over the past 3 weeks, Marcus continued, you have made 37 discriminatory comments on record. You've given harsher sentences to minority defendants than to white defendants for identical crimes. You've dismissed valid legal arguments based solely on the speaker's apparent background. He gestured to Andre and the other teenagers in the front row. These young people all received unjust sentences in your courtroom. Thanks to your treatment of Dandra Williams, we now have concrete evidence of your bias. Judge Reynolds tried to speak, but no words came out. The courtroom had erupted into excited whispers. Furthermore, Marcus added, pulling out a thick folder, we have reviewed your last 5 years of cases. The pattern of discrimination is clear and documented. This evidence has already been submitted to the Judicial Review Board. One of the board members stood up. Judge Reynolds, in light of this evidence, you are temporarily suspended from the bench pending a full investigation. Please step down immediately. The judge's face turned red with fury. You planned this? You tricked me. No, Your Honor, Marcus replied calmly. You revealed yourself. I simply gave you the opportunity to show who you really are. The only difference between me and these other young people is that I had the power to expose your prejudice. As court officers approached the bench, Judge Reynolds finally seemed to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Her career was over, destroyed by her own biased actions against someone she had underestimated because of his appearance. Marcus turned to the gathered teenagers, including his cousin Andre. This is what justice looks like, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. It doesn't matter what you wear or how you speak, you have the right to fair treatment under the law. The courtroom erupted in applause as Judge Reynolds was escorted out, her head bowed in shame. Marcus's plan had worked perfectly, and years of judicial prejudice had finally been exposed. The news spread like wildfire through the city. By that evening, every major news channel was running the story. Harvard lawyer goes undercover to expose judicial racism. Camera crews crowded outside the courthouse, eager to catch a glimpse of the young attorney who had pulled off such a daring plan. Marcus sat in his office at Thompson & Associates, his hoodie and baggy jeans replaced by his usual sharp suit. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since morning. Sarah brought in another cup of coffee and closed the door, shutting out the noise of excited colleagues in the hallway. The Judicial Review Board just called, she said, sitting down across from him. They're starting emergency reviews of all Judge Reynolds' cases from the past 5 years. Andrew's case will be one of the first they look at. Marcus nodded, thinking of his young cousin who had sparked this whole mission. How many cases are we talking about? Over 3,000, Sarah replied, checking her tablet. And that's just the juvenile cases. The board thinks at least half of them might need to be reconsidered. The door opened, and Mr. Thompson himself walked in, the founding partner of the firm who had supported Marcus's risky plan from the start. "Marcus, my boy, you've done something extraordinary here." The older lawyer's eyes were bright with pride. "But we're not done yet. The press is demanding interviews, and we need to handle this carefully." "I don't want this to be about me," Marcus said firmly. "It needs to be about the kids who suffered under her bias, about fixing the system." Just then, this phone buzzed with a text from Andra. "You're all over TikTok, cuz. Everyone at school's talking about what you did. Thank you." A smile spread across Marcus's face as he remembered Judge Reynolds' shocked expression when he revealed his true identity. But his satisfaction was mixed with sadness for all the young people who had faced her prejudice over the years. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Marcus gave a carefully planned press conference on the courthouse steps, surrounded by some of Judge Reynolds' past victims and their families. News cameras flashed as he spoke. "This isn't just about one judge," he told the crowd. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to hide behind authority. Every young person deserves to be judged by their actions, not their appearance or background." Behind him stood Andrea and several other teenagers, their faces hopeful for the first time in months. Their cases would all be reviewed now, their futures no longer determined by one person's bias. Back in his office that evening, Marcus watched as social media exploded with the story. Video clips of his revelation in court had leaked online, showing the exact moment Judge Reynolds realized she had been exposed. The comments were overwhelming. "This is what using privilege to fight for justice looks like. Man really pulled a whole undercover operation to expose racism. Legend. Harvard lawyer pretends to be a street kid. Oh no, reverse card on judicial racism." Sarah rushed in with breaking news. "Marcus, Judge Reynolds just announced her resignation. She's not even waiting for the investigation to finish." Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling both triumphant and exhausted. On his desk was a pile of letters, requests from other law firms wanting to join the fight, offers for him to speak at law schools, and most importantly, pleas from families who suspected their own cases had been tainted by judicial bias. "We've got a lot of work ahead," he told Sarah, picking up one of the letters. "This was never just about Judge Reynolds. There are others like her out there." Mr. Thompson appeared in the doorway again. "The State Bar Association wants to create a special task force to investigate judicial bias across the state. They want you to lead it, Marcus." Marcus looked at the wall of his office, where he had pinned the fake ID he used as Deandra Williams next to his Harvard Law diploma. The contrast between them told the story of why his mission had worked, because he could navigate both worlds, using his privilege to expose injustice. "One judge down," he said quietly, "but this is just the beginning. The whole system needs to change." Sarah grinned. "Well, after what you just pulled off, I'd say the system doesn't stand a chance. Ready to get back to work?" Marcus straightened his tie and stood up. There were more cases to review, more judges to investigate, and more young lives to save from prejudice. His undercover days might be over, but his fight for justice was just beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus appeared before Judge Reynolds 3 more times. Each appearance was carefully planned to reveal more of her deep-rooted prejudices. Today would be his 4th time in her courtroom, and Sarah had warned him that the judge was in an especially bad mood. Another black teenager was just released by a different judge this morning, Sarah whispered to Marcus in the holding area. Judge Reynolds was furious, said the system was getting too soft. Marcus nodded, adjusting his oversized hoodie. He had chosen to wear red today, knowing the judge had made negative comments about gang colors in previous cases. Their hidden cameras needed to catch every prejudiced reaction. In the courtroom, Marcus noticed more observers than usual. Word had started spreading about the street-smart kid who kept quoting legal cases, and several lawyers had come to watch. Among them were 3 members of the Judicial Review Board, disguised as regular spectators. "Mr. Williams," Judge Reynolds said as Marcus approached the bench, "I see you're still making interesting fashion choices." Her eyes narrowed at his red hoodie. "It's all I got, Your Honor," Marcus replied, playing his role perfectly. "Been reading them law books at the library, like you suggested last time." Judge Reynolds laughed dismissively. "Have you now? And I suppose you understand what you've read. This was the opening Marcus had been waiting for. He straightened up slightly, but kept his voice humble. Well, Your Honor, I was reading about Bailey versus Thompson, where the court ruled that circumstantial evidence without corroborating testimony doesn't meet the burden of proof in petty theft cases. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Reynolds' face turned slightly red. Mr. Williams, I've warned you about playing lawyer in my courtroom. But Your Honor, Sarah stepped in, right on cue. My client is merely exercising his right to participate in his defense. The case he cited is directly relevant. Ms. Chen, Judge Reynolds cut her off sharply. I won't have my courtroom turned into a circus by some juvenile delinquent who memorized a few legal terms. She turned her stern gaze to Marcus. Mr. Williams, your attempts to manipulate this court with borrowed knowledge won't work. Marcus noticed several lawyers in the gallery exchanging concerned looks. One was quietly taking notes. Everything was going according to plan. Your Honor, Marcus said, allowing a hint of real legal precision to enter his voice, Article 7 of the state constitution guarantees my right to. Enough. Judge Reynolds slammed her gavel so hard that several people jumped. I've had quite enough of your disrespect. 2 days in juvenile detention for contempt of court. Sarah immediately protested. Your Honor, that's highly irregular for a simple. Would you like to join your client, Ms. Chen? Judge Reynolds threatened. Her face was now fully flushed with anger. I've spent 15 years dealing with young men like Mr. Williams. They think they can outsmart the system, but they all end up in the same place. The court reporter's fingers were flying across her keyboard, capturing every word of the judge's outburst. In the gallery, one of the Judicial Review Board members had pulled out his phone and was quietly recording the scene. As the bailiff led Marcus away, Judge Reynolds called out, Perhaps some time in detention will teach you the difference between real legal knowledge and whatever you've picked up on the streets. Back in the holding cell, Marcus could barely contain his excitement. The judge had played right into their hands, demonstrating exactly the kind of prejudice they needed to document. Her assumption that a young black man couldn't possibly have real legal knowledge was now on record. Sarah visited him an hour later, disguised as his public defender checking on her client. Marcus, she whispered, it's working even better than we planned. 3 other defense attorneys approached me after court. They've had similar experiences with Judge Reynolds, but never thought they could prove it. They want to help. Marcus smiled. Perfect. And the detention order? Already appealed to Judge Martinez. She'll release you tomorrow morning, citing procedural irregularities. But Marcus, Sarah looked worried. Judge Reynolds is getting suspicious. She's asked her clerk to look into your background more thoroughly. Then it's time for the final phase, Marcus said firmly. Next week, we reveal everything. Have the Judicial Review Board ready. And Sarah? He grinned. Make sure someone brings a camera. I want to see her face when she realizes who I really am. 3 months after Judge Reynolds' resignation, the changes in the city's justice system were impossible to ignore. Marcus sat in a large conference room at the State Judicial Center, surrounded by stacks of case files. On the wall, a large screen showed the numbers they had uncovered. Over 1,500 cases reviewed, 380 sentences reduced or dismissed, and 42 young people released from juvenile detention. Mr. Johnson, a young black teenager, said from the doorway. It was Michael, one of the first kids they had helped. He was wearing a school uniform and carrying a backpack. I just wanted to say thanks again. I'm back in school now, and my grades are good. Marcus smiled, remembering how Michael had received 6 months in juvenile detention from Judge Reynolds for jumping a subway turnstile. His case had been one of the first they overturned. That's great news, Michael. Keep working hard, Marcus said warmly. As the teenager left, Sarah walked in with more files. You won't believe this, she said, dropping the files on his desk. 2 more judges just resigned. Looks like they saw what happened to Reynolds and decided to quit before anyone could investigate them too. The news didn't surprise Marcus. His undercover operation had started something bigger than he'd expected. Judges across the state were now being watched closely for signs of bias. Every courtroom had mandatory video recording, and a new civilian review board checked random cases each week. His phone buzzed with a text from Andra. Guess what, cuz? Got accepted to law school. You started something big." Marcus smiled at the message. His cousin had become inspired after watching the changes Marcus had created. Andrew wasn't the only one. Applications to law school from minority students had doubled in the past 3 months. Later that afternoon, Marcus visited the Juvenile Detention Center where he ran a new legal education program. The classroom was full of teenagers, many of whom had faced judges like Reynolds. "Remember," he told them, writing on the whiteboard, "knowing your rights is the first step to protecting them. Today we're going to learn about the Fourth Amendment." As he taught, Marcus noticed some of the teens wearing t-shirts with his photo on them. The shirts said, "Justice has no dress code," a phrase he'd used during his revelation in court that had become a movement slogan. After class, he met with his new team at the Justice Reform Center they had established. The center, funded by donations that had poured in after his story went viral, provided free legal help to young people facing bias in court. "We got 20 new volunteer lawyers," his assistant reported. "And 3 more cities want to start similar programs. They're asking if you can help train their teams." Marcus nodded, looking at the map on the wall where they tracked their progress. Red pins showed where they had found biased judges. Green pins showed where new oversight programs had been established. The green pins were slowly outnumbering the red ones. "Channel 5 is here for your interview," Sarah reminded him. "They're doing a special report on the changes in the system since the Reynolds case." As the camera crew set up, Marcus thought about how much had changed. His old office at Thompson and Associates was now empty. He had left to run the Justice Reform Center full-time. His designer suits hung in the closet most days, replaced by more casual clothes that made the kids he worked with feel comfortable. "Mr. Johnson," the reporter began, "it's been 3 months since you exposed Judge Reynolds. Did you expect your actions to cause such big changes?" Marcus looked directly into the camera. "The change was always possible," he said. "All I did was prove that the bias was real. The real heroes are these young people who never lost hope, even when the system was against them." After the interview, Marcus received another surprise visitor, Judge Martinez, one of the few judges who had supported his undercover mission from the start. "The state Supreme Court wants you to help design new training programs for judges," she told him. "They want to make sure what happened with Reynolds never happens again." Marcus looked at his busy calendar and smiled. Tonight he was speaking at a high school. Tomorrow he had 3 case reviews, and next week he was meeting with state legislators about new oversight laws. One case opened all these doors, he thought. One chance to expose the truth changed the whole system. His phone buzzed again. Another teenager needed help with an unfair judge. Marcus grabbed his jacket, ready to get back to work. The revolution he had started was far from over. 1 year to the day after Marcus had exposed Judge Reynolds, he stood in the largest courtroom of the state Supreme Court building. The room was packed with people, teenagers he had helped, lawyers who had joined his cause, and families whose lives had been changed by his actions. Today was special. The state was officially opening its first Youth Justice Center, a place where young people could get free legal help and learn about their rights. Even more importantly, they were celebrating the passage of the Fair Justice Act, a law that required regular reviews of judges' decisions for signs of bias. Marcus adjusted his tie as he prepared to speak. In the front row sat Andrew, now in his first year of law school, alongside Michael and other young people whose cases had been overturned. Behind them sat Sarah, who had become the director of their expanding legal team. 1 year ago, Marcus began, his voice strong and clear, I stood in a courtroom pretending to be someone else. Today, I stand here as myself, but I'm not standing alone. He gestured to the crowd. Look around this room. Every person here represents a victory for justice. Every young face you see is someone who got a second chance. Every lawyer here is someone who chose to fight for what's right. The big screen behind him showed the numbers that proved their success. 3,000 cases reviewed, 800 unfair sentences overturned, 15 biased judges removed, and 50 new youth legal education programs started across the state. But the biggest change, Marcus continued, isn't in these numbers. It's in the belief that justice can be fair. It's in the hope I see when I visit schools and detention centers. It's in the way our courtrooms now truly serve all people equally. As if to prove his point, the back doors opened, and a familiar face walked in. Judge Reynolds herself. She had asked to speak at the ceremony, and Marcus had agreed. She looked different now, humbler, as she approached the podium. "Mr. Johnson exposed more than just my bias," she said quietly. "He exposed a problem that many of us didn't want to see in ourselves. Today, I work with the Youth Justice Center, teaching judges how to recognize and overcome their own prejudices." Marcus watched as some of the teenagers in the audience nodded in forgiveness. It was another kind of victory, not just changing the system, but changing hearts and minds. After the ceremony, Marcus walked through the new Youth Justice Center. The walls were bright and welcoming, decorated with art made by local teenagers. Each room was named after a young person whose life had been changed by their work. The Andrew Johnson room was where they taught legal education classes. In the main hall, a large mural showed Marcus in both his personas. The Harvard lawyer in a suit on one side, the street-smart kid in a hoodie on the other. Below it were the words that had started it all. "Justice has no dress code." "Mr. J," a voice called out. A group of teenagers rushed up to him, excited to show him their mock trial presentations. They were part of the center's new youth advocacy program, learning to become the next generation of justice warriors. Sarah appeared with more good news. "The governor just called. 5 more states want to copy our program. They're asking for your help to set them up." Marcus smiled, remembering how this all started with one case, his cousin Andrew's unfair arrest. Now it had grown into a national movement. Next week, he was speaking to Congress about making their reforms federal law. His phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Thompson, his old boss. "Saw you on the news. You've done more for justice in 1 year than most lawyers do in a lifetime. Proud of you, son." As the sun set outside the Justice Center, Marcus sat in his office, looking at 2 framed items on his wall. One was his Harvard Law diploma. The other was the fake ID he had used as Dean Williams. Between them hung a new edition, a copy of the Fair Justice Act, signed by the governor. Andre knocked on his door. "Ready to teach our evening class, cuz? The kids are waiting." Marcus stood up, grabbing his teaching materials. The class was full of teenagers who reminded him of himself, of Ander, of all the young people who just needed a fair chance. Justice isn't just about changing laws, he thought as he walked to the classroom. It's about changing lives, one person at a time. The story of Marcus Johnson and Judge Reynolds was now taught in law schools across the country. But for Marcus, the real story was in the faces of the young people who now had hope. Hope that the law would see them for who they really were, not what they looked like or where they came from. As he opened the classroom door, 20 eager faces looked up at him. The future of justice was in this room, and it looked brighter than ever.